are changing. But another verse for us to look at in this program is 1 Corinthians 13:1. Let me read it, and then Jennifer jump in, and why this verse is also key to you. Paul, after in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he's talking about the very visible gifts of the Spirit that were being experienced in the church in Corinth. He then turns and says, well, wait a second, let me show you even a better way. And that's when he turns into the beautiful chapter 13 about love. But he begins it with this verse: if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal.
Speaking of that idea of the verse you never saw, I mean, I'm sure I came across that when I was, first reading the New Testament. But it was, when I saw it again, it really, it was one of those aha moments of how could I have not seen this? And that was the moment when I read that verse, when I first realized that even though, the conversion process had been going very well, I'd read all the right books and I believed intellectually, it made me realize that I didn't have that relationship with Jesus Christ, that I intellectually, I believed, and I had even been, arguing against other atheists, telling them they needed to believe in Christianity too. But then when I saw that verse in 1 Corinthians, I thought, do I really have love? And then I thought, how do you speak with such love? This is such a gorgeous, it's really like a poem, that whole chapter 13. And I thought, I'm not doing that. Why am I not doing that? And that's when I realized that my conversion thus far had been a reading project. It was more like writing a doctoral thesis than coming to know the living God. So that verse was like, wow, I'd never seen that before.
Yeah, a parallel verse is in 1 John, in which he talks a lot about love. In one section says, if you say you love God but hate your neighbor, you're lying.
Right.
And love is not in you. And so it's an active thing. Did atheists think of love as an active thing?
No. Love is, you can't speak for all atheists, but
Right.
certainly the predominant vibe was love is a feeling. And so, and that's, you see that a lot in divorce culture, that I saw a lot of people in that culture who would say, the feelings aren't there anymore. I don't have the positive emotions. And so therefore I'm getting a divorce. And it was very sad, especially after my conversion, to realize that, certainly in some cases marriages have many difficult problems, but I really did see cases where literally it was by these couples' own admission, it was nothing more than that they didn't have the positive rush of feelings when they thought about each other, so they thought that they were not in love.
Which would describe, almost obviously, why couples will resort to whatever it takes, chemically, drug-wise, to somehow restore that feeling.
Right.
Restore the excitement, restore whatever it would take to bring that back. And even to the point of they couldn't even talk about, the feeling's gone, but I'm going to love you. The way that you would call to love a person if the feeling's gone.
Right.
They wouldn't even go there, because by definition, hey, if the feeling is there, we move on until I can find someone, or I found someone that felt this feeling and you're gone.
Yep. And so I think maybe one of the reasons that I originally kind of skipped over this passage when I was first reading the New Testament was because I didn't even have this lexicon for this idea of loving someone if I didn't have positive feelings about them. I think what I would have said is, even if I were trying, in my very early, sort of toddling way to preach the gospel, if I was feeling annoyed with the person, I would sort of throw up my hands and say, well, I don't love them. What can I do? I can't help but be rude. That's my experience. That's my feeling. And I didn't have this concept of, it doesn't matter if internally I might be feeling agitated. I can still love them by showing them love through my actions.
To an atheist, is believing an intellectual concept or a feeling?
Depends on the person, but I think they would say it is an intellectual concept. I think they would say we have evaluated the evidence, we've evaluated the data, and decided that atheism is the most reasonable position. However, and I've it's sort of been a ministry, I guess you could say, that the Lord has given me, given the nature of what I write about on my blogs. My email inbox is full of stories of atheists, former atheists, agnostics, in all different phases of conversion. And what I've come to see is, on the surface level, yes, it's. I do think there is a lot of intellectual confusion in our culture right now, and that these people, a lot of them, make intellectual decisions. But I think that the root of it is always a disposition of heart. You can't hear the truth unless you're open to it. And until you have that moment of openness, you're never going to be able to hear it.
Yeah, because the reason I was thinking that is if love is a feeling, and so if to love a person, that feeling somehow has to be enticed, or a good part of Christianity is loving God. And so if love of God is this feeling and I don't feel it,
right,
then it's like an atheist can't even have a faith in God. If it's a feeling, it's got to be there. If it ain't there, it ain't there.
I think that's a great point, actually. In atheist circles, you'll hear them denounce this idea of feelings. We don't base any of our belief on feelings. But what I've found is that very often that is how it starts. They don't like to talk about this, but maybe when they were in high school or college, they prayed to God, they didn't feel his presence, they didn't feel like they got an answer, and then they discover Richard Dawkins or P.Z. Myers, and then the intellectual drifting away starts. But it started with that moment where they say, I'm feeling bad. I don't feel, we have the term consolation. I think people, they don't even understand that's a term, that they say I'm lacking consolation, somewhere in their mind. And then because of the state that our culture is in, they think, well, that must mean that God doesn't exist or that he doesn't love me. I must not love him, if the feelings aren't there.
Yeah.
It's like a divorce in a way.
Well, Wesley talks about, in his own conversion, John Wesley, about he felt this warmth that to him was a sign of the movement within his heart. And you'll often hear that people talk about it in their own conversion. Well, hey, if it ain't there you even mentioned it yourself, that when you first started praying, you were expecting
right.
that to happen, and it didn't happen.
And I took that to mean that God must not exist, because through cultural osmosis, I had just sort of learned, quote unquote, I thought it was correct that to know God is to have a bunch of feelings about God. And so when I first prayed and I didn't get those feelings, I thought, oh, well, that must mean that God doesn't exist. But it's interesting that it was then, as I said on the show, that I discovered a book that really turned me on to the possibility that Jesus was who he said he was. And so it was then that that was when I really, I don't know, that was when sorry, I guess that was when I really realized that it has to be more than just intellectual, because I did keep praying, even though it was, faltering, bad prayers, but I kept at it. And I think that's when I started to see that this is an act of love in a way, even though I'm not feeling anything.
So when Paul goes on in verse 4 to describe what love is, if you love is an active effort, that you do this to another person regardless of your feelings, you are patient, kind, not jealous or boastful, not arrogant or rude, especially rude. Remember that word when I get back to it. Does not insist on his own way, is not irritable, does not rejoice in wrong, rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. So in other words, bloggers that don't live by that are nothing but clanging cymbals and noisy gongs.
We have it from Paul right there. It's true. I mean, and that's a temptation, because the anonymity of the internet, it tempts us, doesn't it, to just say things that you'd never say to a person's face. And that, we need to just admit it, when we are being clanging cymbals.
Yeah. And again, some of those qualities he describes are exactly what you can hear behind some of the internet writings that are very hurtful. very rude, not caring about the impact of what they're saying.
Right.
And I think in some ways, I'm not implying, Jennifer, with your quickness of it, I think that's a gift, and I appreciate that completely. But when I'm hesitant, it's mainly more out of my self-doubt before I push that publish button. But a lot of it is to make sure
Right.
that I'm this way to anyone I might write about.
That's it. And, you bring up a good point. And I will say, if I'm speaking about something that I'm passionate about, I mean, there are some times when I write a post, and these are the ones that I do quickly, where it's, it's not a controversial subject. I am feeling at peace about it. And those are the ones that I think, I don't look over it too carefully. But when I'm writing about something that I am passionate about, or that other people are passionate about, or if I'm speaking on a topic where someone else has been in error, and so I'm kind of maybe gently correcting them, or just showing a different perspective, those are the ones they do sit on my computer for a while, because like you said, I don't want to be a clanging cymbal.
Yeah. I think he was anticipating that that love would involve the desire to be helpful to other people by writing. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is indeed write, because we have a responsibility to give, and we're going to look at that in a little bit at the next verse when we come back from the break,
Right.
Because we live in an age in which the truth needs to be proclaimed. But let's take another break. You're listening to Deep in Scripture. This is your host, Marcus Grote. I am joined today by Jennifer Fulwiler.